March 17th, 180 AD. Marcus Aurelius lies dying in a military camp near modern-day Vienna. He is 58 years old, exhausted by decades of war and plague. His officers gather around him, weeping. And the dying emperor says something that would echo through 2,000 years of human history. This is the story of how the philosopher-emperor died, and why the way he died may be more important than anything he wrote. By the late 170s, Marcus had been at war for over a decade. The Marcomannic Wars, fought along the Danube frontier against Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, had consumed what should have been the final peaceful years of his reign. He was not a natural warrior. He was a philosopher who inherited an empire under siege and spent the rest of his life defending it. By 179, the campaigns were showing progress. Marcus was planning what he believed would be the final offensive, one that would secure the frontier permanently. Historians believe he intended to create new provinces north of the Danube, an expansion that would have changed Europe's map. But his body was failing. Ancient sources describe chronic stomach illness, chest pain, and fatigue. By the winter of 179, he was visibly weakened. His physicians attended him constantly, and yet he refused to leave. The campaign wasn't finished. The frontier wasn't secure. His soldiers needed him present. So Marcus stayed, pushing his body past its limits, writing in his journal by candlelight, holding the line between empire and collapse. Hanging over everything was the Antonine Plague. It had struck the empire in 165 AD, 15 years before Marcus's death, and it never fully disappeared. It would flare, recede, and return. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 5 million. The plague shaped Marcus's reign more profoundly than any war. It decimated his legions. It emptied entire towns along the frontier. It killed his co-emperor Lucius Verus in 169. It may have killed several of Marcus's own children, and it created a constant atmosphere of death that Marcus lived inside for the last 15 years of his life. This is the context that makes the Meditations so remarkable. They were written by a man surrounded by death, daily confronting the mortality he kept urging himself to accept. Every passage about impermanence was written within earshot of soldiers dying from disease. Marcus didn't write about death as a philosophical exercise. He wrote about it as a daily reality, and that reality was closing in on him. In early March of 180 AD, Marcus fell seriously ill at his military headquarters in Vindobona, near modern-day Vienna. The ancient historian Cassius Dio provides the most detailed account of what followed. Marcus knew he was dying. He had spent 19 years preparing for this moment in his journal. He had written about it more than any other subject. And now it was here, not as a philosophical concept, as a physical reality. His body was shutting down. He summoned his son Commodus, who would succeed him as emperor. According to Dio, Marcus entrusted Commodus to the care of his officers and advisors, asking them to guide the young emperor. He reportedly expressed concern about the unfinished campaign, about leaving the frontier vulnerable. Even in his final hours, his mind was on duty. Then Marcus did something that only a Stoic would do. He refused to eat or drink, not as a dramatic gesture, as a deliberate choice. He was ready. He had done what he could. The campaign, the empire, his son, all of it would continue or fail without him. And rather than cling to a few more painful days, he chose to meet death on his own terms. Ancient sources describe his final days as calm, not peaceful in the sentimental sense, calm in the Stoic sense. He had already accepted what was happening. He had been accepting it every morning for 19 years. The death he had meditated on thousands of times was no longer an abstract idea. It was the next breath. And Marcus had spent his entire philosophical life ensuring that when this moment came, he would not flinch. What Marcus said on his deathbed has been recorded in different versions by different historians, but the core is consistent across accounts. His officers wept. The men who had followed him through a decade of war stood around his bed and cried. And Marcus, the dying emperor, looked at them and said, "Why do you weep for me? Think rather of the pestilence and the death that affects so many." Even in his final moments, he was redirecting attention away from himself. He was doing what the meditations had taught him to do, see his own experience in proportion to the larger whole. His death was one death. The plague had taken millions. His grief was one grief. The empire carried the grief of entire cities. He refused to let his own ending become the center of the story when so many others were suffering worse. This was not performance. This was the man the meditations describe. A man who had spent 2 decades training himself to see clearly, to place his own life in cosmic context, and to serve something larger than his personal survival. The deathbed words weren't composed for an audience. They were the natural output of a mind that had practiced this perspective every single day. There's a line in Book 12 that reads like a rehearsal for this exact moment. Marcus writes, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly." He wrote that to himself, alone in a tent, years before the end. And when the end came, he lived it. Marcus Aurelius died on March 17, 180 AD. He was the last of the so-called 5 good emperors, and most historians mark his death as the beginning of Rome's long decline. His son Commodus was a disaster. The stability Marcus had fought to maintain unraveled within a decade. But the meditations survived. The private journal that was never meant for publication became one of the most widely read books in human history. And the reason it survived is that Marcus didn't just write philosophy, he lived it. All the way to the end. Most people fear death because they haven't prepared for it. They treat it as an event that will happen someday in the vague future. Marcus treated it as a daily companion. He practiced dying every morning so that when the real death came, it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a crisis. It was the last day of a practice he had been doing for 19 years. His death teaches one lesson above all others. You don't get to choose when you die. You get to choose how you arrive at that moment. And the way you arrive is determined entirely by how you spend the days before it. Every morning you practice presence, gratitude, acceptance, and service. You're building the character that will carry you through the end. Every morning you avoid those things, you're arriving less prepared. Marcus arrived fully prepared, not because he was fearless, but because he had stared at this moment so many times in his mind that when it finally came, he recognized it. And recognition is the opposite of panic. Here's your challenge. Write your own eulogy, not the one you hope people will give someday. The one they would give today based on how you've actually lived so far. Be honest. What would they say? What would they leave out? What would be missing? Then below it, write the eulogy you want, the one you're working toward, the version that includes the things you haven't done yet, the person you haven't fully become. The gap between those two eulogies is your remaining work. Marcus would say that gap is not a failure. It's a map. And the only question that matters is whether you'll follow it, starting tomorrow, while there's still time to close the distance. On March 17, 180 AD, the philosopher-emperor died in a military camp on the frozen frontier of the Roman Empire. He had spent 19 years preparing for that moment. And when it came, he met it exactly the way he had practiced, with clarity, with acceptance, with concern for others instead of himself. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. If this changed how you think about how you want to arrive at the end, subscribe for more ancient wisdom that still works today. Drop a comment telling me what would be missing from your eulogy today. I read every single one.